Welcome to the second half of this Ask the CIO discussion. My guest for this segment is Grad Khan, the Chief Experience Officer at Sprinklr. Grad, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.
Jason, I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for the time. Looking forward to this discussion.
We just heard from Lasanda Hodge from the General Services Administration Center of Excellence. She talked a lot about the trends that we're seeing across government, some of the things that the COE is doing to work with agencies to really improve how they're addressing customer experience, improving customer service. We're going to get to a whole lot of different pieces and parts to that discussion. But one of the things I'd like to start with, what she mentioned, is this idea of trying to reframe the customer experience. What are some of the trends you're seeing as you talk to your customers, whether in government or the private sector?
Right. It's a great question. And we've got customers around the world, large and small, public sector, private sector. So we have a wide variety of customers. And so we had a chance to sort of see what's going on trend-wise. And while it was underway, there's no question that the last year and a half has accelerated this trend of thinking of experience as your brand. Now, the word brand's not a heavily used word in public sector, but everyone has a brand. When you say IRS, I think of a certain thing, a certain set of emotions that are associated with the IRS. In my particular case, they're actually very positive. But everyone has a set of sort of emotional attributes that they can apply against a government agency, a service, a product, a roll of toilet paper. So everyone's got a brand. People have brands, et cetera. And what we're seeing is that people have now understood that the brand really is defined by the experience that you give people. And there was kind of a classic sort of approach where people would do these complicated brand exercises and they would tell people what their brand was. And in this world of telling, everyone felt very comfortable. We've told people that we're the friendly company or we're the responsive company or whatever that is. The reality is that people are very resistant to being told things these days. And they actually don't need to listen to what they're being told anymore because they've got access to a global network of more than 4 billion people who are telling them what that brand is all about. And so the brand is actually now being defined by the experience that it delivers and what people are saying about that experience. And so if you really want to affect your brand, your image, and the way that people approach you, you have to change or update or alter your experiences to get people to talk about you in a new way. And that will ultimately positively impact your brand.
It's a fascinating approach in the sense that the government does not think that way too often. I think you see a few agencies are starting to kind of move in that direction where they understand that the public's perception of them, and I think the IRS is a really great example, really matters more than whether or not they've collected all the taxes or how they've collected taxes. But if people have a good experience, when you bring this to federal executives, do they get it, or well, we're not the private sector? Do they still have that type of mentality?
Well, it depends. Things sort of change all the time. I actually worked for almost 10 years. I had an ad agency that was 100% focused on public sector. So I'm reasonably familiar with the space. And there's been a lot of progress because a lot of people from private sector have moved into public sector. In public sector, very innovative in many ways. And I think the IRS is a good example where, having people live in a constant state of fear actually was causing people to be less engaged with the agency, and it created more problems ultimately down the road. Being more approachable, being more engageable actually can create better outcomes, and I think ultimately will actually increase tax revenue, not decrease it. I think also agencies are beginning to realize that having a good brand is helpful in other ways. It's much easier to talk to lawmakers about funding. It's much easier to get suppliers to sort of engage with you. It's much easier to drive change in the organization, and really importantly, it's much easier to hire. Right. And the competition for talent is true, not just in the private sector, but in the public sector as well. It's getting harder and harder to find people because of the demographic shift. So we've had this baby bust that's kind of rolling through our demographics, and it's hard to find people. It's hard to find experienced managers. So there's a competition for talent, and talent will go to good brands. I want to work somewhere that when I say I work at XYZ agency, people go, that's fantastic. I'm very good friends with Bob McDonald. And Bob was the head of the VA. secretary of the VA for a number of years. Bob and I worked together at Procter and Gamble, and then he went on to become a CEO, and then went to the VA. And Bob drove a lot of really innovative stuff at the VA. Many of those programs are continuing today, and a lot of what Bob was trying to do is bring private sector ideas and practices into the VA to try to update it and try to improve the brand and try to get the VA to be a stronger agency and grow. And I think that's just going to continue happening across all the agencies.
And what you've seen with the VA specifically, since you brought them up, is a huge increase in their employee and their customer satisfaction. They talk about it all the time, and they have one of the first agencies to have a very similar position to yours, a chief customer or
Right.
chief experience officer, chief customer experience officer in many ways, and they've really been leading the way. Now, VA is on one side of the spectrum. There are many other agencies on the other side of the spectrum, and you heard LaShonda talk about the customer experience playbook that the COE put out a few years ago,
Yep.
and how they're maybe taking a half a step back and re-looking at that. And they've developed this thing called a framework. And that's really a maturity issue for a lot of agencies. How do you get to the point where you can use the framework? The playbook. So discuss some of the challenges you're seeing for agencies and how are they starting to overcome them when it comes to improving their customer experience?
Well, I'll be maybe a tiny bit contrarian here, and this will be a little bit of private sector salt and pepper to bring to the public sector steak here. And I think LaShonda's talk was great, by the way. And she was very focused actually on social listening and bringing the voice of the customer in. What she didn't touch on, and she just may not be aware of the kinds of tools that are out there, is that, where I work, and there are many other things like Sprinkler, but you can actually aggregate all of those comments into a single view. And I think what is challenging for a lot of agencies is they are aware of the fact that people have moved to social platforms, but it's not just social platforms, right? Forums like Reddit, very, very important. Blogs, there are 500 million blogs now, super important. Review sites, these things are all over the place. So there's a lot of public discourse going on the interwebs, as I like to say. And when people look at this at a less mature stage, it feels overwhelming because there's no way to process it. There are literally 400 million data feeds going into Sprinkler. Like, that's what you have to do to pull all this together. So in our case, we use AI to help sort it and then actually help people know how to respond. Now, the responses need to always be by a human, except if it's what are the park hours, or what are the, like something simple you can actually do with a bot. But generally, you're going to need a human, but you can help that human be more productive by sorting and suggesting and putting things into buckets. And when you see things that way, suddenly that voice of the customer becomes something that you can sort of respond to, or in the case of public sector, the voice of the citizen. And I would say that my contrarian point of view here is I would spend less time on frameworks and sort of thinking about what to do. And I would spend more time on getting the actual citizen voice in and seeing what people are saying. When I first started this process, and it was about 10 years ago when I began this at Microsoft, I was CMO for Microsoft US. We started that way. We didn't really know what to do. We had a bunch of stuff we'd sort of thought about, but we started just listening. And pretty soon we were like, we have to respond to this stuff. Like, we can't just, these people are in pain, or they were upset, or they needed help, and we had to get back to them. And so then that sort of created this whole insight to action framework that we started using. But it was really about getting your hands into the machine, getting going. And I would say, see what citizens are saying about you, understand that, start to talk to them, start to get feedback. We've worked very, very closely with the Census Bureau, and they've done an amazing job of that. There's all sorts of disinformation going on about the census. Obviously, that disinformation was incredibly harmful to the census, and it's very important that the census be done correctly for a whole bunch of political reasons and economic issues. And so they were actually able to identify all that disinformation and then directly address it. So someone would say, I think it's red, and they were able to go in and say, no, it's blue, and be able to always provide the full story. And that had a really positive impact on what people were talking about and seeing in the census. And so, there are a number of agencies doing this right now. We worked really closely with other agencies in the defense field, where recruiting is really challenging. And again, same idea, able to identify people who are talking about it, thinking about it, get in there, talk to them and address it. And I would say that there's an addictive quality to hearing what the citizens really say, like real citizens are really saying stuff. There's an addictive quality to like being able to actually engage with them. It's very tactile and it's very sort of, I think it's very stimulating because it makes you realize the impact that you're having. And it becomes less of an academic exercise and more of the reality of helping change people's lives and helping build the country.
So let me be a little contrarian to your contrarian for a second as well.
Sweet.
So we can build upon the contrarianness of this discussion. I don't think there's an agency that is not listening to their customers. And I think I'll try to infer what LaShonda was trying to get at is that's the maturity level that agencies are to use that data.
Yeah.
So as you well know, you can collect a ton of data, but if you don't understand the data, if you're not processing the data, if you're not seeing the value, finding the haystack in the needle of needles or whatever the expression.
Needle in the haystack. Yeah.
Oh, I know, but this is the needle.
A lot
in the
of
haystack.
haystacks. I get you.
So is this a matter of agencies, the maturity level versus if you just jump in and because what I think I hear you say is don't be afraid to jump into the deep end and swim through the data. And I think what she was saying was you're already collecting this data, but you have to put your toe in the water to understanding the data. And then you can slowly get into knee deep and then to your waist and et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Help me kind of parse that together.
And I'm not speaking just to public sector here. This is a general observation I would have across all of our customers. So the nuance here is that there is a difference between systems that are listening systems and systems that are insight to action systems. So what a lot of systems do is they listen across the modern channels. I was describing them a few minutes ago, but they take a sample and then they create a sentiment score. So it's kind of like a survey, but a survey of public unsolicited data, right? And then people can see this is how we're doing. So that's one way of doing it. A lot of people do that. The challenge with that is that you're not doing anything about it. And to really alter customer experience, I think this idea of separating, like getting sentiment score and then trying to go fix it is the wrong approach. I think the right approach is to pull in every single comment people make about you, not sample, but pull in every single comment that people make about you and attempt to respond to and fix and repair and celebrate, because sometimes they're very positive comments, right? Celebrate and amplify all of those comments. Now, you're not going to get there right away because the volume will be higher than what you've probably staffed to. But as you start to do that, and as you see the impact of that, generally your curve goes up. And so the contrast I'm driving is people are measuring and looking at it, but they're looking at it in a researchy way. And this is, again, not just a public sector comment. This is a general comment across the planet right now. But I would recommend, and what our most advanced customers do, is that you take a perspective that I want to hear and respond to the comments of every single one of my citizens, customers, however you want to define that. There are companies that are actually doing this. L'Oreal, large packaged goods company based in France. Their current plan is to respond to every single comment made about them and their products, every single comment. Now, they're not quite there yet, but what they're doing is they're essentially scaling. There's obviously a Sprinkler customer, so that's how I know this. They're scaling Sprinkler throughout their org. They've got thousands of seats, and they're making everybody connect to and engage with customers. It's a really bold ambition, but I actually believe that the future, and future being, say, 10 years from now, the future of packaged goods companies, public sector companies, you name it, it's going to be that we're all going to be responding to all the comments that people are making about us.
That's a great example from L'Oreal to try to respond to all comments. You see that sometimes on a Yelp review, for instance, where restaurants do a really nice job of thank you for coming in. Sorry you had this experience, or great to hear you had this great experience. I can imagine for a company like that, how much more difficult that is. And you brought up the use of AI and you didn't mention cloud, but I'm sure it's in there. Where does the technology fit into this that can make all of this a little easier, a little more effective?
Yeah, so we are we are a SaaS product. We're on all of the clouds. So Google Cloud, Azure, and AWS, and we actually run our citizen engagement piece on the uh, government approved pieces of those clouds. So they've all got a government FedRAMP approved sort of version of it. So and so the reason that's helpful is that it gives us infinite scale. And our current data store is more than 16 petabytes, because we're essentially creating a local copy of every conversation out there, which is billions of conversations. And just the public ones, obviously. We're not looking at any private conversations. These are public conversations that people are posting for all to read. But the tech, for me, the most important thing, and I have a slight bias here, so I'll expose my bias for a second. But I worked in healthcare for a long time. I actually launched a product called Microsoft Health Vault, which was the first online PHR, and did that in concert with a number of agencies. And we worked very closely with MHS and the VA and helped unify those two systems by using Health Vault as a sort of an intermediary layer. Back when, I mean, it's really kind of cool. The VA is moving off Vista, moving to the Cerner system. So there's going to be, I think, more coordination between MHS and the VA, but they worked really hard to try to get themselves to connect through Health Vault. And what I saw in healthcare was that most hospitals had built large collections of point solutions, and ultimately we had a lot of problems, particularly driving outcomes, because the relatively fragile APIs of cloud SaaS solutions, they break often because SaaS solutions are constantly being updated. And so one gets updated, the whole stack goes down, and the APIs are just generally more fragile as a result. And so there is a company called Epic Healthcare based in Madison, Wisconsin, one of the great companies out there, an amazing founder. And they had this vision that ultimately, to deliver the outcomes that are required in healthcare, you would need to have a unified single system. So I could see all the measurements. And one simple example would be sepsis. Sepsis, there are about 3 different measurements, temperature being one of them, 3 different measurements that will tell you that somebody is headed into sepsis. And if you catch it early, it's very easy to avoid. Unfortunately, in an integrated system or a best of breed system, those systems are rarely able to connect to each other. And so often people get into sepsis very deeply and at a very high risk level before it's noticed. With an Epic system, they have a sepsis warning built right in. All those systems are integrated and they can catch it really quickly. Much of really positive outcomes as a result. Congestive heart failure is a very similar thing as well. And so it's what's been fascinating to watch is that when I started working in healthcare around 2006 or so, Epic was definitely on the upswing, but there was still this massive sort of debate about best of breed versus unified platform. Is it best of breed? Is it unified? The debate is over now. Epic is about 60% of the market, continuing to grow very quickly. Cerner is actually moving to a unified platform. So that's everyone's kind of taken that approach and that perspective. And that's where that market has gone. And healthcare is always a little ahead of the rest of us in IT because it's a very, very innovative space, particularly in the US. So if you look at what people are talking about in customer experience, what has sort of happened, and this is just kind of okay, like this is a thing that happens in early stage markets, is people have bought a survey tool and they've bought a email automation tool, and they bought a bunch of different tools, and they sort of kind of connected them together in this sort of connected, cobbled together best of breed system. And they're finding that's really hard to deliver great experience because these things don't talk to each other and they don't work very well together. And there's a lot of latency in the system, so I can't make great recommendations. And so just like every other market, we're seeing the MarTech market move now towards unified platforms. And the great thing is that Sprinklr made a bet a long time ago to be a unified CXM platform. So that's been a wonderful motion for us. And I'll just like one other example on why unified is always the inevitability. Like think about the iPhone. How many devices has your iPhone replaced? Like a table full of devices, video recorders and cameras and tape recorders and notebooks and all calendars, and all that stuff is now unified into a single platform on your iPhone. It's the inevitably everything goes this way. And so in customer experience, I think we're still very, very early innings in this game, but in customer experience, what we're seeing among our more sophisticated customers and what we'll see generally in the market is people will be moving to unified platforms platforms in order to actually deliver the kind of customer experience that their customers or citizens deserve.
Brad, we're just about out of time. Before I let you go, what's the big takeaway from the conversation with LaShonda, and what's the message you want to make sure federal agencies, federal executives hear about customer experience?
Well, I think the one thing that I would sort of like land, and she talked a lot about social listening. She talked a lot about connecting with citizens. I love that. And I actually think that's true at any level of government. People complaining about potholes is something that people do publicly, and that can be very helpful for a city government that wants to get reelected, make sure the potholes are filled. But I think it's the one thing that I would do is make sure you've thought through what your end-to-end citizen engagement platform looks like. And typically you'll see sort of a 5-stage process of gathering the information that people are sort of publicly spewing out there, sorting it through some kind of sophisticated AI platform, creating a 360-degree profile of that customer, then allowing yourselves in your own agency and ideally between agencies to collaborate around that customer profile and be able to help that customer achieve their goals and then engage with them. And I think if you can go from this gather to engage, or what I call insight to action, you can create a very powerful agency that people love working with. And I think that will put wind in the sails for funding, for hiring, and for engagement with citizens broadly.
All right, and it goes back to create your brand, understand your brand, promote your brand, listen to keep your brand at a, if you will, a high level and a well-respected one. So this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time. We are out of time for today. So let me thank my guests. LaShonda Hodge is the Managing Director of Customer Experience at the Centers of Excellence at the General Services Administration. And you just heard from Grad Khan, the Chief Experience Officer at Sprinklr. Grad, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Jason. That was great.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Ask the CIO on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Ask the CIO.